They're outnumbered, but Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says his troops are holding out in the battle for Sievierodonetsk. Russian forces are fighting for the city street by street. Victory could be key for them, seizing control of the eastern Donbas region.
A village near the front line in Donbas after a Russian missile strike. An elderly woman was killed, the latest victim in a war that has lasted over 100 days and continues to inflict misery on the people of Ukraine.
How am I supposed to feel? We lived peacefully, normally. The street was peaceful. We have nothing here of value, nothing. And yet they bombed us.
In the embattled city of Sievierodonetsk, Ukraine claims to be pushing back Russian troops. And Moscow has confirmed that yet another of its generals was killed during a visit to the front. The US, the UK and Germany have moved to counter Russian firepower by pledging to send Ukraine rocket launchers with a range of up to 80 kilometers. Russia's foreign minister doubled down on the Kremlin's defiant response.
I can only add that the longer the range of weapons you supply, the further we will move the front line away from our territory, beyond which neo-Nazis can threaten the Russian Federation.
In a war marked by Russian setbacks and stiff Ukrainian resistance, it won't be easy to back such words with action.
DW correspondent Jan-Philipp Schultz is in Kyiv. What more can you tell us about the fight for the east?
There is heavy fighting going on in many parts of the Donbas region, especially in the key city of Sievierodonetsk. In some parts of the city there is intense street fighting continuing, but the situation on the ground is changing every hour, Ukrainian officials say. Commanders say that they still have enough forces, but they are clearly outgunned by the Russians. And in several parts of the city there is basically everything destroyed. In another important city, this is Sievierodonetsk, very nearby, there are new Russian artillery attacks, and a lot of observers predict that there will be more heavy fighting in this area in the coming days.
What about in the south, the Black Sea, where the Russian fleet had been blocking grain supplies to the rest of the world?
Yes, there have been some interesting developments on the Black Sea. Ukrainian Navy commanders say that the famous Russian Black Sea fleet has been regrouping, and several ships have withdrawn to more than 100 kilometers off the Ukrainian coast. Ukrainians interpret this as a sign that the Russians are losing some control in this part of the Black Sea. Of course, it's interesting to see what this new development means for the ongoing sea blockade of grain supplies. As you said, this is one of the most pressing political issues at the moment because it directly contributes to the deteriorating food security in many parts of the world.
And any more information about those who died and those who surrendered at the Azovstal steel plant where that siege went on for weeks?
Well, President Zelenskyy says that more than 2,500 fighters from the Azovstal fighting have been detained in the Donbas region. The Russian plans what to do with those fighters seem to change every day. Of course, they are highly important for President Putin because the fighting around the famous Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol was one of the most symbolic during the war so far. There have been reports that the Russians are planning some kind of public tribunals, but President Zelenskyy says that they are doing everything to free those fighters, to bring them home safely, and there have been the Russians have handed over in the past days some soldiers that were killed during the fighting.
Jan-Philipp Schultz for us in Kyiv. To our military analyst, Frank Lewicz, who joins us from Oxford. What are the chances Ukrainian troops will manage to push back Russian forces from Sievierodonetsk?
Well, Ben, it's a very complex situation. As Jan Philip said there, this is the very paradigm urban warfare of the fog of war. It's very difficult to know where your units are at any one time. And of course, there are multiple axes in cities. So we don't know. I suspect the Ukrainians their purpose is clearly to inflict casualties on the Russians rather than to hold the city. So I think we'll see over the next week or so, maybe shorter, the city will fall. But what's interesting around there is the Russians are still trying to cut the road into it near a place called Bakhmut. They've been trying that now for about 2 weeks without success. So the Russians are really the Ukrainians are really holding on there quite effectively.
We've also been hearing about longer-range rocket systems on their way from the West, and we've talked about this before, but Ukraine says it needs a constant supply of artillery. Can the West deliver that?
Yes, Ben. One of the things which has not been stressed over the last few days until now are the numbers of launches. So I think the Americans are sending 4 HIMARS multi-launch rocket systems, 4, that's 4 trucks, and the British, I think, are 4, maybe 3. This is a drop in the ocean. I was talking to a senior British Army officer yesterday who was actually an artillery commander for 10 or 20 years, very experienced in this line of work. And I asked him what kind of effect is that going to have against the Russian echelons. And he said, well, a drop in the ocean, really, it doesn't provide you that much firepower. So I said, how many would they need? And this echoes what he's going to say, what Mr. Arestovich has quoted on your report before. He says, well, I think 100 might make a difference, but half a dozen or a dozen is neither here nor there. So the Ukrainians are right. They need more, and they need them soon, and a lot more to make a difference on the front.
OK, Jan Philip also mentioned Russia's Black Sea Fleet withdrawing to allow through grain supplies. Couldn't those very battleships regroup and pop up somewhere else?
I don't think they could do that effectively. What's happened here is that Danish and British missiles are called Harpoons, have probably been deployed now, or near to that. The Russians won't know whether they are or not, but they have to act as if they are. And that means that area in the northwest Black Sea is now being challenged out to about 100 kilometers from the Ukrainian coast. Interestingly, the Russians have now been forced to deploy more anti-aircraft missiles into Crimea, not against Ukrainian aircraft, but against Ukrainian missiles. So that battle for the northwest Black Sea, that's the approaches, remember, to Odessa, which of course means essentially Ukrainian trade routes, is very much a going concern. And I think we're going to see that intensify over the next few weeks, that naval aspect to defend Odessa.
OK, thank you very much for the update. The insight there from military analyst Frank Lewicz. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
And joining me now at the big table is the foreign policy and security analyst Jessica Berlin. She's a familiar face to our viewers. Jessica just returned from a visit to Ukraine. It's good to have you back. You were in the capital, Kyiv. You got back just before these explosions, these attacks took place. So you got back before this new shock. What was it like in the capital? Because it seemed the war maybe was permanently somewhere else.
Well, that's perhaps an impression that's been had here in Western Europe, but for the citizens of Ukraine, including, of course, in the capital, Kyiv, that's not been the sense. There is no sense that the war is now far away and cannot reach the capital. On the contrary, even on the very first day when I arrived, the receptionist at the hotel guided me to a room that was less attractive, but to the side, in case of an airstrike, that I would be better protected against flying glass from buildings opposite us. So on this very quotidian level, the people in the city of Kyiv have been on alert and on guard this entire time. It's certainly not a time for complacency.
And I know you and I, we've talked before about the way Europe has responded to the aggression coming from Russia and to helping Ukrainian forces. I mean, you've been critical of Germany's role here, or the lack, maybe some would say, of a role. And you tweeted here, let me get this right, that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has become Putin's most useful idiot?
Yes, the term useful idiot is coming from the Soviet Union, was used by the Soviet government intelligence agencies to refer to somebody who was ostensibly not an ally, but who was believing Soviet propaganda and actually advancing the Soviet agenda through Annäherung, shall we say, through proactive steps toward the Soviet line. And in this way, unfortunately, the German government and increasingly the French government have been acting in a way as the newest useful idiots for Vladimir Putin. He has been using a very consistent messaging, knowing that he can threaten, he can bully, he can intimidate the voting publics of Western democracies in order to try to hinder our democratically elected governments from supplying Ukraine with the weapons they need to survive. But let's be very clear. What the Ukrainians are up against right now is the ultimate David and Goliath battle that we have not seen the likes of which in Europe since World War II. And you mentioned earlier on the show, today is the 78th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. And what I saw in Ukraine truly echoed the courage of the Allied soldiers during D-Day who came to liberate Europe. But that coupled with the courage of the everyday men and women of England, the citizens of London during the Blitz, that kind of raw courage and stiff upper lip also amongst the populace. It's truly striking, and it's really a moment where our governments in the West need to open their eyes and recognize Putin for what he is, a 21st century Hitler.
That's quite a statement to make, and you also touch upon the sacrifices that were made during the Blitz, but sacrifices that were made by all the countries that were sending troops, Allied troops. Today, what we hear, the biggest connection that we hear here in Germany, but Western Europe, in North America, is the price of gasoline.
Yes.
And if it goes too high, then it becomes politically untenable for the president, the chancellor, and then they have to take actions to relieve consumer pocketbook pressure. There's no talk about sacrifice. There's no talk about principles at that level.
Germany is the richest country in Europe. We are the fourth largest economy in the world, and we are also the fourth largest weapons producer in the world. If this country, rooted in the history of the war, we were freed, we have a democracy because the Allied troops and so many members of resistance forces fought against our fascist government in the 1930s and 40s. If we, Germany, are not willing to put our money and our military capacity where our morals ostensibly are, then we have truly betrayed everything the Federal Republic stands for. And this is unfortunately the lesson and the message that's being heard loud and clear in Kiev and by our allies across Eastern and Central Europe. They have seen that Germany is not the steadfast, strong, and deep-pocketed ally that they thought. Just in the first 2 months of this war, the German government spent over 9 billion euros on Russian oil and gas. That is a huge amount. And the amount of money, by contrast, that we've sent to Ukraine in support is simply dwarfed by that amount.
And when economists talk about what would happen if the country were to go cold turkey when it comes to Russian oil and gas, there would be an economic shock. It maybe could be worse than the crisis that we saw in the 1970s. So immediately that possibility then is pushed to the side.
Pushed to the side, certainly not. But you mentioned the word sacrifice before. This is what we're looking at. Are we willing to take an economic shock? Are we willing to face recession in order to protect freedom and democracy and the lives of millions of innocent people in Ukraine? That's really the question. And we just came out of the COVID crisis. Well, we're still kind of in it. But our governments were able to mobilize incredible resources to help small businesses and struggling families survive through the crisis. Certainly, many people and businesses suffered. We really took a hit as a collective economy. But it was to save lives. It was to stop the spread of the disease. And now I fear we need to do it again. I know it's hard and it sounds scary, but this is the moment that we face. And the German government has not made clear to the German people that this is the stakes that we face.
How much of this is trying to fight against political inertia? And I'm talking about 12 years of leadership by Angela Merkel, who was a conservative, but also was considered, the Putin whisperer for leaders like Barack Obama, for example. That inertia from her policies obviously didn't, those policies didn't end overnight with this new government.
Certainly not.
Is Germany still struggling to maybe shed more than a decade of Merkelism?
I fear that Frau Merkel's mastery of the middle gutted a great deal of our ability to have an open discourse about difficult topics in Germany. This is an unfortunate side effect. I have a lot of respect for many things that she did, but I find also that this lack of robust engagement and taking difficult decisions and difficult topics head on in our society has really suffered. And I get the sense also from Chancellor Scholz that he very easily wanted to slide into his chancellorship. He was vice chancellor under Merkel, of course, finance minister. He's been a mayor of Hamburg. And I think on paper, it made a lot of sense for him to become chancellor. He really enjoys himself in that role. But he was not expecting to have to suddenly become a chancellor of the largest power in Europe during wartime. And as we've seen, I mean, I was very willing to give him credit and benefit of the doubt at the beginning of this crisis. And during his Zeitenwende speech, I was really actually excited and hopeful. I thought this was a new side of Germany coming out. But unfortunately, since that time, we've been quite disappointed. The Ukrainian government has said openly that they are no longer taking Germany as its word because it doesn't follow with action. And we really need to see a new side of Germany and a new side of this chancellor if Ukraine is going to survive this fight.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a lot of valid points, and I think a lot of members of the Green Party here in the country would agree with you, and they would say, maybe this is the irony that it's the Greens who have been maybe on the right side of history earlier than the traditional big tent parties. We'll see what happens moving forward, but always good to get your insight, your opinions. Jessica Berlin, thank you.
Thanks, Brent.